Hello, I'm Kreya and welcome to the course. Today we're going to be talking about an overview of the course, what are the lessons that we're going to try to achieve, and the kind of the general vibes of the lesson. We'll be covering how to make a VTuber model, mostly kind of focusing on the concepts and methods used to make a model. And don't worry, and about the terms that we're going to be using in this introduction, don't worry too much about them. And because we're going to be either referencing them later on or expanding more on them later. So first, we want to start with. First, I want to start with what is the main activity when we do art? Because to optimize kind of our learning, we kind of have to break down the activities that we're going to be doing, right? So when we do art, what are we doing? So the main activity in art is like expressing what's in your head and transferring it into a medium. It doesn't matter if it's 2D or 3D or some smaller facet of art. It could include like representation of making nodes, making this, you know what I mean. So in learning art, we have to buy into this idea of categorizing them into these two skills. So the first one is the things that are in your head, which is like your knowledge about anatomy, your knowledge about contrast, your knowledge about light, all these things. And this also includes smaller, more specific knowledge, like what is a specular, etc. And the next one is like, then the next part of like transferring it into a medium, like knowing your tools, like from the big things of how do you use Unity to more specific things, like what does color dodge even do? We'll tackle that later. And this also includes things like your actual skill of moving your hand to get a certain line, right? Literally your draftsmanship skills. How do you draw a straight line, and things like that, and knowing kind of like perspective, etc., which is a little bit not going to be in our scope because we're in 3D, but you're getting what I mean. And how we transferred it into a medium, like knowing your tools, from the big things of like knowing how to use Unity to even the very small specific things like how does color dodge work. And this also includes your actual skill of moving your hand to make a certain line, like your draftsmanship skills, like making circles, making lines, making a perspective object, which is, well, not going to be used much in our 3D, but also I'm terrible at draftsmanship. I apologize. That's why I do 3D. Haha. And for for a better term, for a shorter term, for both of these, we can call both of these like conceptual and procedural knowledge. And when I say conceptual and concepts, I really do mean it in like the loosest way that possible. It can be just a very small idea, or it can be just like a very small effect. So I guess when I say small effect, I'm actually going to give an example because, I want to drill it down how small it can be and maybe kind of like give context about how small give context. So we're going to go here, and actually we're going to go into shading, and then we're going to go here. So this is a procedural setup that I've done for my previous model. And there's this certain concept that I want to focus on. And this is the procedural setup. You can change almost all the variables here. I say almost all because some are like, yeah, you can change them, but let's try changing this. This is So if you look at that, look at how it affects but yeah, that's not what we're going to focus on. Look at how it affects the hair. I was gonna say, but yeah, that's not what we're going to focus on. What I want to focus on is this idea. Because when I encountered this idea, I didn't know that it was called anisotropic specular, and all I knew from what I was looking at from the inspirations of this coloring is that they just did it. They just had this effect on the hair, and I just wanted to replicate it. So I just replicated it by what I'm able to do, which is here, which is this. I replicated it in a procedural way. And it's this. And we can show you that it's this. And yeah, all these smaller observations about it that I got from the source reference is like this bleed edge right here, this random thing right here, and obviously the color rate. We'll talk about this because this is actually not the final color. The final color is heavily adjusted. It is a crutch, I'd say, but yeah. But it makes the colors more coordinated. So what can you do? It is what it is. So we will talk about these nodes more later. So what I'm trying to get at here is that you don't need to know the words used to communicate this effect. You don't need to know what is this, what is this. What's important is just that you see them and you notice them, and then you try to think about them in a way that how will you make them by your own means, right? Because if my original reference was to make this effect, they would most likely just draw them themselves, because that's what they are able to do. And that goes the same for me. I just do it this way because this is what I am able to do. And I use certain concepts like UV flows and mapping and sort of like some randomness to achieve this effect. So, but yeah, repeating the point, what matters is that you kind of notice that if you notice something, like you notice something you like, you notice something this, you notice something that, you try to think about it in like, how will you make this effect with the things that you currently know, with the things that you currently know. And there's nothing wrong with copying what I did. There's nothing wrong with copying what they did. But thinking about it on your own scope, like on your own ways, on your own knowledge, reinforces a mindset of thinking about how to use what you know. And this is important because it can relate to building trust with your own skills. And we can go on a whole tangent of like, why does trust on your own skills matter? And maybe, okay, I'll give a short TLDR of why I think trust on your skills matter. Trust on your skills matter because it lets you make decisions. And when you make decisions, you are able to be receptive of proper feedback, because proper feedback kind of like properly attacks your decisions. And by the way, not paying attention to something is also a kind of decision. What to pay attention to is also a decision. So yeah. But the next thing about that is that being a little bit more confident or a little bit more trusting of your skills opens you to be more open-minded and all the things that comes with that. But then as you do this, there's going to be a point where you're going to find a solution that works for you, which is great, or you're going to kind of run into a roadblock. But when you run into this roadblock, it's important to think about what is this roadblock and what is actually really stopping you. Because sometimes the roadblock is not really what's stopping you. Okay, we'll give an example later. When you run into this roadblock, it's important to think what about it is stopping you. And sometimes it's not even the roadblock itself that's stopping you. And it could be because you're overwhelmed by the things that you have to consider. I can try to give this as an example, but I don't think I can because I deleted all the unnecessary bit. But when you look at this is actually already a consequence of how I kind of dealt with overwhelming things in like making shaders like this, because there's a lot of nodes and I don't even use this anymore, but yeah. Because look at the structure of all of these nodes, and everything is kind of contained on itself and everything is kind of like modular, because this is one of the lessons that I learned. And yes, there is going to be more redundant data in here, but it's a trade-off that you make. So that's one of the things that, and maybe some actually, there's also another case for that where you need more variables and proper definitions of the concepts involved in order to make an effect. And maybe we'll see some of those later. Okay, maybe we give another example. Maybe you could be limited by your draftsmanship skills, you know? Because sometimes some problems just literally just demand your effort, you know? Let's be real. We are all kind of like sort of lazy, and there are actual tasks out there that you're just looking at them, you're just staring at them, and there's nothing actually stopping you from doing them. The thing that's stopping you from doing them is it requires a little bit too much effort, you know? But this, I mean, I guess it doesn't apply as much here because specifically for learning draftsmanship skills, well, I haven't learned my own draftsmanship skills, but I guess I'll tangent into specifically for learning. You kind of have to spend effective effort, right? But what does effective effort mean? Well, basically, effective effort is you're going to min max decisions per unit time. And that's actually one of the main reasons of why I showcase that rigging thing on Twitter of like trying to structurize how to rig and then blah 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 blah. Basically, this is one of the reasons for it. Making, you know, I just tried to min max decisions per unit time. So okay, we're turning into tangent into tangent into tangent, but this is entertaining to spread out. It's entertaining to kind of give more examples. So next is like spending your time thinking about something that's like unknowable. Since we talked about rigging, this came to mind. This is a very important topic because it's all about making decisions that are about just literally taking the L and assuming that you will be redoing it in the future, you know, because there's going to be decisions that you're going to make that are just going to be guesses. Just make the best guess that you can, because sometimes knowing the correct answer is unreasonable to think about, or, you know, it's unknowable or unreasonable to think about. And when all things are done, one example of this is actually the physics bones, because a physics bone is like connected like this, connected like this, connected like this, and maybe they have some other orientations in like 3D space, but whatever. But basically they're connected all around. And then there's going to be forces applied to this object. And what happens is that you're basically trying to predict a pendulum, which is, I mean, you can try, but good luck. But I guess there are ways to have a more intuitive prediction of what's going to happen. And we're going to be discussing those, a little bit of those of trying to quantify, not quantify, okay. Let's stop using those kind of words. Those are scary words. It's trying to, or I guess we can make it so that we at least have a small intuition of how it's gonna work. So what else? Okay, last one. So sometimes the problem is that you just easily get distracted, you know, and this is going to be a bit more of a personal answer, because sometimes, yeah, we do get distracted. And I guess what I can give is that there's going to be my solution. It doesn't need to be working for you, but try to accept ideas in the same way as I try to emphasize how you absorb other ideas. You know, ideas, try to think about ideas as something that you can use for your own advantage. It doesn't matter if the idea is true, it doesn't matter. Okay, but we're going to another tangent. So let's stop. I'm just going to leave you with try to approach ideas in order for them to, and try to integrate them in a way that they will be advantageous to you. So we'll talk a bit more about that later, maybe. Sometimes you get easily distracted. So my solution was to this was just change the environment as much as your means allows you to. So make the situation or make the environment around you, make you think about the things that you want to think about. It makes you think about the goals that you want. It makes you think about the correct things at specific times. Now, okay, there's a lot to unpack there, but I guess we can give like a very small example of like what are the things that we can change. And this one is a change that everyone can do. Everyone can do this. So let's pick one aspect of this. So one very small piece of this that we can try to explore is that is a very small piece of this whole, because this is a whole kind of activity that you kind of like you change small things there. But yeah, what does a small thing look like in this kind of like mindset of like changing your environment? Well, one thing I do, and I do emphasize it as like a thing that I do because you might want a different approach, you might not like the approach or things like this. So yeah, again, ideas to your advantage. One thing that I do is that I remove things like Twitter and YouTube on my phone. And I just use the browser and I don't log in for YouTube. And I have a plugin that removes kind of recommendations. But you'll realize that I'm still able to use it. The goal is not to kind of force me to stop. It's more of like the usage has to be a little bit more intentional. But I guess that's a bit, if you don't want that, there's also another way. Oh, and yeah, if I want to watch someone's content and then I better remember the name, What I'm going to say next is that there's no shame in like doom scrolling or whatever, or like getting lost in TikTok. Why? Because, these sites literally have millions of people trying to get your attention. And not just millions of people. There's very smart people behind YouTube and TikTok, trying to serve you kind of like the best content that, that'll make you stay. So there's really no shame to it. I just want to say that because maybe you're at peace with that. Maybe you're okay with that, which is totally fine. Or if you don't want that, and you can make these sites work for you then and use like the mute/not interested/don't recommend this channel function. And basically just mute everything that really doesn't contribute to your goals. Like memes and drama and like the C Block retrospective. Well, shout out to Dosh. It's very good. It's very fun. So the whole point is decreasing unnecessary things that occupy your mind. And we will talk about this in the next chapter. And there's some reasons to it. And there's some insights from actual psychologists and papers about it. And yeah, we'll talk about it later. But now you see that the roadblocks are not limited to art and 3D. And especially for some people out there. And the solutions can be broad, and it can be a whole tangent or a whole subject in itself. But let's slow down and think, how do we approach these roadblocks or just the general problems that we encounter? Because sometimes you can rely on intuition, but sometimes intuition kind of only gets us so far. So if we want a framework to lean upon whenever you get lost, and hopefully this framework kind of becomes the new normal of how we think about things. So this framework is the classic problem solving framework, and it's split into 4 major steps. I adapted it a little bit to art. So first is that we're going to try to identify the relevant concepts. So what are you trying to figure out? What are the things that affect this? And sometimes for art, it's about getting references. And maybe for some concepts that you want to dive deeper is that sometimes you have to dive into some research papers, because I saw one that was fascinating about color and a relationship between color and emotion. Color and emotion. And it was so fascinating because we don't really need hard data on it, or like, it's not, I get it is a research paper, but I do feel that it's not as rigorous as it can be for a general population, because some words, some letters mean different for other people. But yeah, it's a paper that we will be seeing later. Or although you can just search for it, it's like if you just search color and emotion and then maybe research paper, and then maybe you'll find it. It's something about it also relates the words for the color and then the color themselves, and how different is it? Like, is the idea of red also represent, is the word red also representing anger, or is it just the color of red? So yeah, it's very interesting. And again, it doesn't have to be fully true. What we care about is kind of like, what is like, is there a trend line of it that is like significant enough that we can infer some information? It's not, art is not that exact of a science. So next is like, but the next step is like predicting. So the second step is now predicting the outcome. So, and this is an easily forgotten step, and we'll talk about that, I guess, later. So as best you can predict the outcome. So as best you can predict the outcome based on the solutions that you present. And this might feel awkward because you picked that tool because you expect it to produce the results that you want. But sometimes you have to be honest in that you think it will just work out. You pick that tool because you think it's just going to work out, this and that, But sometimes it doesn't. And then there's this thing that's going to happen, that it's either you misunderstood your tool or you misunderstood what it takes or what is required for that concept to happen. And it's not the tool's fault, it's like the concept's fault. And for the tool, I do mean it in the loosest way possible, the same way as the concept one. A tool can be as small as this node here, right here. Okay? Like, how does this node work? Blah, 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 blah. So the first step is like identify relevant concepts. The next is like predicting the outcome. So the next one is like execute your solution. And there's nothing much here apart from the executing things, but do try to execute it by how you set it up initially. Like, trying to minimize reactive adjustments to your methods, and just there's nothing much apart from executing things here, but try to execute them by how you set them up initially, and try to minimize like reactive adjustments to your methods when you're seeing that the tool you're picking is not working. This is what I mean by like, you sneakily change this into something else because it was not working. So, I mean, you're allowed a few of these, but when it's getting a little bit too much, you might have to relax and kind of pause, because what might be happening is that there's a good chance that you're getting stuck in the loop of fixing this, fixing that. And it's either you don't, again, you misunderstood your tool, or you misunderstood like what is required to make that effect happen. And what I mean by that is that let's say this one, like, you misunderstood what you misunderstood what it takes to make this happen. And let's say you did this and you tried to make it like a mixed node, and then you made it to 0. But that's not going to work, because we'll talk about why it won't work maybe later. And hopefully you will get an intuitive understanding of why it will not work. I mean, it will work very differently if you use mix. We're rambling. So the last step is like evaluate your solution. So the next thing is evaluate your answer, but seeing how it kind of compares to your kind of predicted estimate, and try to kind of reason of what went wrong. And sometimes when you get an unsatisfactory results, like the one example we tried to talk about, of like you pausing because, things got a bit out of hand, you don't need to delete all the setup. You don't need to that kind of restart, you just need to scope into the issue and kind of restart this again, kind of like identify the relevant concepts on the things that went wrong. And hopefully you have a little bit more insight on what happened based on your execution of it. And yeah, I was going to re-mention the part that I said about predicting the outcome of like, it's easily forgotten. And I want to emphasize that because it really is. And I try to emphasize it in order for people to kind of stop, guys. Don't ignore it, because yes, it's very easy to just test things and see if it will work. Like, see this one, and then you go boop, and yeah, it doesn't work, and you go poop again. Oh yeah, it doesn't work, and then you go until you find a good one. But that really is, I mean, that can be productive if you're only trying to observe what this does. Okay? But this is just an example. I don't actually mean the actual color dodge node itself. But I really do mean it, like, for example, this whole thing not working, right? I'm just using this as a smaller example. And it's very easy to just also devolve into just testing it, this and that, because it's important to try to think about how it works, because we come back to the first part of we're saying of what we want to reinforce. It's like that we want to reinforce a mindset of like thinking about what you know and thinking about how do you use what you know. And yeah, and like in order to kind of build trust on your skills, because you will be needing a lot of you will be needing a lot of faith sometimes, especially when you go for like the eyes where it looks so, you have to trust the process, because the eyes really feel bad if until you get to the last part, right? So it doesn't have to be anything rigorous where you list down everything like what affects this, what affects this, what affects this, you know you just kind of have to have it on your mind sometimes, especially for the smaller ones, because the important thing is that you try to think about it, because sometimes if we have to enforce too much of heavy rules, and then things just won't get done. So the implementation is kind of like we have to be a little bit more softer about it, especially when you're kind of starting to think about it, starting to apply it into yourself and things like that. We kind of have to be a little bit more softer. So, and yeah, you don't have to list everything down. Not everything has to be this big, overarching scope of like designing the whole thing from scratch, right? You can do it with like just one small effect at a time, and then you modularize your solution. So yeah, hopefully that this problem solving technique can be a guiding star, and hopefully it becomes a default eventually. But we do have to address that art has a lot of components to it, and sometimes the execution of some parts are reliant on the other parts. Like for example, maybe you did achieve your like flow and composition target, but let's say you lack some knowledge about anatomy, and maybe you kind of forced it a little bit. So the model will maybe look off by how it's postured. And this also happens because you also adapt to parts you've already drawn, and how one aspect kind of depends on your understanding of other aspects. But this is too much of maybe like a hand wavy thing. One simpler examples of these are in games where, let's say like Dota or League or Deadlock, this player skill called CS skill that is highly relevant in the early parts of the game where you kind of gather your initial resources. And if you're good or bad at this skill, then as the game develops, it affects the scope of the things that you are able to do. And let's say your other player skill is that you're very good when you are at a certain advantage. Like you know how to close out games. But if you had a terrible start because of your CS skill, then your whole other skill can't be completely utilized. This is what we mean about multifaceted skills, where the skill of playing the game or doing art is made up of all these smaller skills that kind of affect each other and affect their actual performance of the other skills. So how do we approach this? Well, okay. Well, the short answer is we're trying to kind of just focus at one aspect at a time. But the long answer is it's about a research paper about the performance of a group in like a particular game, where the difference is the researchers kind of telling them what to focus on and like kind of providing UI elements to help them focus on these aspects. Okay, but that's going to be a very long story again. Maybe I can actually find that paper and link it if people are interested. So now, for example, well, if we're going to do this doesn't mean that you won't draw the face. When we focus on the eye, this doesn't mean you just you just forget the face and you just draw the eye. Now, why is that? It's kind of like everyone has good ideas. And it's just that knowing how to transition and bridge and mesh them together, these are kind of ideas with other ideas, is that it requires you to kind of understand what makes that idea good in the first place. Because I've seen, I'm a little bit obsessed with like how artists draw eyes. I would like to look into it more, but because the eye is actually a good representation of the artist's skill set on how they try to mix colors and do this and that. It's very interesting to look at. But there are some eye drawings I've seen that when it's the eye alone that's showed, it's very, very pretty. But when the eye is made in the context of a character, the style kind of breaks apart because it seems like the eye doesn't really, like, it looks very pretty, by the way. And the artwork actually looks normal, it looks okay. But when it kind of got mixed together, it didn't look correct somehow. And that's something we kind of have to take into account of, like, unless you only want to draw this only, like, let's say if you want to specialize in only faces or only hands, this can be an okay idea. You can try to focus on it, and you don't need to this other context around it. And yeah, you can really do it, especially if you have some things in mind that you are trying to achieve by only doing this. Like, for example, for 3D, there's also there's this advice that I heard when I also was new, that like you can specialize in making just shoes, and then you sell those shoes, those 3D shoes, in like things like Blender Market and stuff like that. And yeah, that can make you a very steady income. You specialize in one accessory or garment or whatever, and then you can try to and sell that into like a marketplace, which is a very good way to make passive income, at least I think. Now we come at the end of chapter 1. I know it's a bit sudden, but I want to mention of like, why do I frame it like this, like with all the learning approach kind of to it, like why this kind of problem solving technique, why this, why that. And because it feels disingenuous to me if I only give if I give a rundown of the node setup and kind of discuss the order of the nodes, like as we go from the base of it, and we go through up and down the nodes, we discuss very small parts of it and big parts of it, and then we start at the start, and then we go to the next bit, and then we go to the next bit, and we just explore these nodes, which is actually what we're going to do. But I want more of your participation participation as we explore it. I actually would want you to, let's say we have an effect like this, I would actually want you later to be solving this effect before we explore our solution. That is kind of what I want you to do, because it forces this. Actually, scratch all of that. We'll scratch all of that, and from the start of like, why do I frame it like this? Okay. And I know it's sudden, but now it's like we're coming to an end of our first. And now it's a bit sudden, but now we're coming to the end of our first chapter. So I have to explain, like, why do I frame it like this? Like, why do, with all these like learning approach to it, like problem solving and things like that. Because to me, because it feels disingenuous to me if I only give you like a rundown of the node setup of like step one, of like the first step, like here. Okay, I'm being up. Like the first step, like here, and then we explore this part, and then we move on to the next part, and then we do this, and then we explore this, and then we move on to the next part, which is honestly what we'll actually do. But why does it feel somewhat disingenuous if I only do that? It doesn't really show you how it was actually made. Like, do you actually start here? Like, maybe, but maybe this was added after all, maybe this part was added all after I made all of this already, right? And I just wanted an extra effect of something like that because, you make this not really in order. You just make this as you want to add more. And maybe you can have some insight of like, I mean, this looks like it's made after this one because, it's modular and things like that. But you never know. And for you as well, you never know how you will only know once you kind of try to kind of give it a shot for yourself. And yeah, again, doing it kind of step by step like that, or I'll at least trying to go through the flow of the nodes and exploring the nodes. Yeah, it doesn't show how it was actually made and like what are the thoughts that are happening in your head and how do we consider this and how do you represent this, etc. And there's this idea in game dev called it's called tutorial hell. And it's all about thinking you're doing something is equal to learning something. Like people are just following kind of instructions and they're not really learning anything. And yes, maybe following this step by step will give you some insight, but what I'm trying to achieve is like I want to do it, we can do it more intentionally. And we can more intentionally. Because what I want to say also is that this course is literally just a step in your journey. And I think this is like the best help that I actually know. This is the best help that I think I can get. And hopefully this helps frame the motivation of this course. And I'll be repeating this reason in the next chapter. So yeah. So thank you for your time today. And hopefully we'll see you in the next chapter.